Hi, Andy.
Hi there. Hi,
Nice
Tom.
to see you. On the MA in Fine Art, we ask students to write something called a critical model dissertation. So it's an 8,000 word long essay. And I wondered if you could just explain, just kind of in your own words, what you understand the critical model dissertation to be and to mean.
Okay. Well, it's a document, it's a piece of work, a piece of research which the student conducts and writes into an 8,000 word document.
Yeah,
But the central thing, the thing which is central to it is the student's work itself. So rather than being about, say, a dissertation on a different artist,
yeah,
let's say a study of their work or a theme or an idea,
yeah,
the work of the student is absolutely central to it. So it's at the core of the project. And really, the objective is to put that work in the context of debates, theories, practices. And when I say practices, I'm thinking of both contemporary art practices
yeah,
and also the precedents for their practice. So it might be to do with looking at historic figures or figures in the 20th century, before that, and so on. So, in a sense, it's a kind of way of what you might call contextualizing the student's practice, setting it in a broader picture of practices and debates. Um,
So I'd
yeah,
imagine that for students to be able to do that, then they'll need to carry out quite a lot of research.
yeah. Well, that's true, and but in a sense that's also supported by tutorials which are dedicated to the dissertation. So those are spread out over the period in which the student researches and writes the thing. But it's also supported by what the students are doing in other modules, the practical study modules
Yeah,
of the course, which in the first phase of the MA program are very much about what we call contextualization. So it's really so there are a series of seminars which involve the students devising a kind of timeline or a family, or trying to identify a family of artists, if you like, to
yeah,
which their work belongs. And that might be in terms of the themes of the work, or it might be to do with the materials of the work, formal characteristics, or it might be to do with wider questions which might be more theoretical, and so on. So really, in a sense, it's something which is parallels the studio practice and its development and its support through dedicated seminars, which focus, as I said, in the first phase of the MA course on this contextualization process. So really, they're not just going into it cold. It's something which is kind of parallels the practical study development over the course of the year.
yeah.
So, or yeah, so in a sense, it's something which is phased. It's something which is supported during that time.
Could you
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about the extent to which students use or expected to use critical theory or philosophical discourses in their writing? Because I know a lot of students are often quite intimidated by that kind of academic writing. Is that something that all students engage with? And if so, how do we introduce them to that?
Okay, well, in within the program, within the art histories component of the MA course, there are a series of critical aesthetics seminars. That's what
Yeah,
they're called, which introduce students to and explore a number of different ideas within the domain of uh, what we might call aesthetics and critical theory. So that might be to do with looking at the history of aesthetic judgments and the development within their development within the philosophical tradition,
yeah,
Western philosophical tradition mainly, I'd say, and also looking at the sort of developments and revisions of those in a more contemporary sense, in terms of contemporary debates and practices which draw on those philosophies and in some instances interrogate them.
yeah.
Uh,
And take in a more
uh,
global perspective, presumably. And they take
could you
in a
say that
more
again?
global perspective.
Yes, that's right. And also to look at, so for instance, if we think about modernist theory
Yeah,
as it was developed in the late 19th through to the mid 20th century or mid to late 20th century, there have been a lot of challenges to that as a consequence of an interest in questions of gender, ethnicity, kind of the post-colonial condition, feminism, gender, and so on. So that's all factored into the seminars, and the seminars do deal and address that. And certainly the sort of complexion of critical theory in its contemporary sense is something we try to register and also encourage students to look into. And they're also guided through that to some degree within the seminar context, which are not lecture format. They're very discursive. They're about clarifying certain points and trying to look at what ideas actually mean in practice.
Yeah.
So rather than students just having to read a huge stack of books in the library, and then really that's what they've got to do. These things are actually supported by through teaching and also through our other members of staff who teach in the studio, and also the person Harriet, who works in the library, who's a terrific source of information and very helpful and supportive of students who are maybe very new to this. So we recognise that people are going to be at different levels. We also recognise that some people are going to have more of an interest in what we might call critical theory than others. The dissertation there isn't a set picture or a pattern of what in terms of what the dissertation has to be. But sure, there is a requirement, there is some engagement with contemporary thought and trying to set one's practice in relation to that in a genuine way as possible, really. So, yeah.
Thank you. So another thing that I'm particularly interested in hearing you speak about is the kind of dynamic relationship between the reading and the writing and the production of work in the studio itself. So obviously the dissertation, we begin the dissertation in around Christmas, January, and the deadline's not until June. And throughout that period, the students are not only writing about their work, but they're making work. And the work develops and evolves through that period. So in your experience, how do you help students negotiate that kind of dynamic relationship between writing about work, which itself is continually evolving?
Yeah, well, also, you mentioned, it starts around about Christmas, January time. I mean, one of the first things we do is that the supervisors attend the presentations which students give on their practice. We have a kind of seminar room set up where students deliver, a 5 to 10 minute PowerPoint presentation where they look at images of their work and also talk about how that practice is evolving and how that's evolving in relation to, as I was saying, this question of contextualization, how it relates to other practices. And, the students, who are beginning to really get to grips with this will also talk about how it relates to what we might call ideas or theories. So the supervisors, who go on to work with the student, between January and June and kind of guide them through or, support them during that time in their research and their writing, are present at that point. So that happens. So they're already familiar with what the student is doing to some degree. And then also the first tutorial point of contact that they have with them in January, I should say, it takes place in the studio. Or if they're a part-time student who doesn't have a studio, a second-year student, on the part-time 2-year route, they'll bring in images of their work and try and show as much as give a clearer picture as possible of what they're doing in their studio practice. Yeah. So it's not the case of a student being sent off to an office where the tutor has no interest or no knowledge of their practice at all, and they're writing a piece of theory. It's very much about this kind of meeting point between the two things. And that sort of meeting point is something that has to be negotiated by each person. It's not a case that theory represents a formula for making better work, if you see what I mean. It's not as simple as that, thank goodness. There's always a kind of tension, sometimes a friction, sometimes that's productive, sometimes that's challenging, between what we might call theory on one side and practice on the other. Yeah. And in a sense, that's where it becomes really interesting. One of the aims, if I could add to that, of the dissertation, perhaps one of the primary aims, is to try, as well as this thing about contextualizing or a kind of advanced contextualization of the practice, is also for the student to write about their work itself and the process of making the work. So some of those things might be quite practical. They might be to do with the use of materials, but it might be also going a bit deeper into the thought process
Yeah.
about how you or how how an artist actually defines or determines how whether a work is successful or not, or what makes one work more successful than another.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, the objective, if we might say, is to go beyond what we might call subjective judgment. You know, so for instance, it might be an example of that might be, you know, in a seminar, a student is asked, you know, why do you think this work is working?
Yeah.
And the student might say, I mean, this is just an example. Might say, well, I just feel that it works.
Yeah.
Okay, now that is a kind of subjective judgment. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually really important.
Yeah.
But the aim is to try and open that up and get beyond this this notion of subjective judgment, a pure subjective judgment, and try and move towards something which is, if not fully objective, because that's not possible, more objective.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's
It's
really what the
just,
critical. Could you say that again? Sorry.
it's the just. I just feel that it works.
Yeah, I mean, one thing.
Up that just, isn't it? Interrogating it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that happens also. Can I just add to that to say that in one thing that happens in the studio seminars when we do, you know, we talk about students' work or they present their work, you know, for discussion, you know, with the tutors and their fellow students who are present, is we try to, in a sense, say, well, it's all very well if somebody says, I really love this piece, you know, or I really don't like this piece. I mean, well, that's not so good. But and it's nice to be affirmative about it. But then where does that kind of get you, you know, in a way? It's nice as a sort of morale booster and, you know, everybody wants their work to be liked. But then there's a question about, well, that can sometimes get in the way of getting into a deeper picture about why a piece of work works,
Yeah.
you know, and so maybe the thing is to sort of keep that on hold a bit and say, well, you know, maybe one way of looking at a work is not so much in terms of whether we like it or not. I mean, that's one thing, but it's a question about why it works or how it works, you know, and that's in the sense one of the key themes, I think, key aspects of the critical model. The critical model is about trying to question those judgments and to set them in a bigger picture.
Yeah.
But at the same time, not to set up a model which is about. I mean, it would be far too reductive for it to be a model for making better work. It's not simply a formula or a panacea in that sense. So yeah.
Finally, just thinking about the period when students graduate, so you know, usually around September, after they've submitted the dissertation,
Yeah.
do you find that the students that you supervise, that their work has been enhanced and enriched by the process of researching and writing the dissertation?
I would say that definitely, yes. In the vast majority of cases, it is like that. I mean, there is a kind of continuing life, if you like, of the thesis, because you know they hand in June,
Yeah.
and then you know they have a 2.5 month period in which they're working just on their studio practice, and often the discussions which take place and the tutors that take place are kind of very different. Partly because the student has been immersed in this process of research, you know, and it's challenging, it's demanding. You know, a lot of students, it's the first time they've really done this advanced contextualization process of their work. So when they come up out of that process, the world does kind of look a bit different.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's the purpose of this kind of study. I'd say there's very few instances where the student, you know, parks it and then forgets it. It's actually something which stays with them in a positive sense. And certainly I would say that it puts students in a stronger position to be able to talk about their work in a truthful way and a way that's genuine, rather than making claims for it that they're not sure about or claims which are perhaps unwarranted. So that's looking at it a bit negatively. But in the vast majority of instances, I think people say it was a really good experience, and also a really good kind of bonding experience because everybody goes through it
Yeah.
in the on the MA course in the graduating year. And so, and they share that experience, and the challenges, the breakthroughs, and the rewards are all part of the course. So, yeah, sure, that period in the summer is a really good one because often we do talk about, well, certainly because I work as a thesis supervisor and involved in marking the theses as well, most years. But I also teach in the studio throughout this time. And often the conversation which take place are people saying, well, actually, this was a really useful, really enriching process, which really opened my eyes and really made me look at my practice in a different way. And so that's its usefulness, I'd say, and that's its role within the course.
Okay, Andy, that's been incredibly useful. Thank
Yeah,
you so
great.
much for that. I'm sure any student thinking of applying to the course or have just beginning their time on the course will find that very useful indeed. So
Great. Thank you.
thank you very much.
Great.
See
Thanks.
you soon.
Cheers.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.